I'd like to welcome you all to GLODEM's fourth book talk of the academic year. And we have the great pleasure of having Dr. Erdem Yörük with us today, where he will speak about his recent book titled The Politics of the Welfare State in Turkey. Before I give the floor to Dr. Yörük, I also would like to briefly speak about our speaker today. Dr. Yörük is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Koç University, and he's also an associate member in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. He's also a member of the Young Academy of Europe and an associate editor of European Review. He holds a PhD from the Department of Sociology at Johns Hopkins University, a master's degree in sociology, and a bachelor's degree in electrical and electronics engineering from Boğaziçi University. His research focuses on social welfare and social policy, social movements, political sociology, and comparative and historical sociology. His work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, Ford Foundation, European Commission's Marie Curie Actions, the European Research Council, and the Science Academy of Turkey budget. His articles have appeared in Politics and Society, New Life Review, Current Sociology, South Atlantic Quarterly, and International Journal of Communication, among others. Without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Dr. Yörük, and we're starting with the question of, can you tell us about the book a little bit?
Thank you very much, Merih. Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about my book. And welcome, everyone. This book was published last year by the University of Michigan Press, and then its translation into Turkish was published by İletişim Yayınları in the same year. And it started. I started working on this project as my PhD dissertation at Johns Hopkins University, and I decided to analyze how and why the Turkish welfare state has changed over the course of the last 4 decades. And after I defended my dissertation, I started to work at Koç University, and I received some support from some research scientific founders. And first I started to compare Turkey with Brazil, and then started to compare Turkey and Brazil with other emerging market countries like China, India, South Africa, Argentina, or Brazil. And this has pretty much convinced me that what is happening in Turkey is a part of a global trend, and countries, the so-called emerging markets, are experiencing similar kind of welfare state developments. And my question became, so can we say that similar kind of political processes could give the same shape or pattern to these countries? So this is basically my broader scientific project for the last, let's say, 15 years. And the countries that I have focused on, including Turkey, experienced a huge welfare state expansion since the 1990s. And this is interesting. I started this book as well with the same observation. This is the time of neoliberalism, and we have been told almost like everywhere that neoliberalism undermines welfare state development, and retrenchment and welfare cuts are the defining characteristics of neoliberalism. But we see that, I mean, the Turkish welfare state has been established in the very period of neoliberalism, like countries in like Brazil, or like India, or like China. So what explains, I mean, is there any problem in our conceptualization of neoliberalism, or do we understand neoliberal welfare state policies in an unsatisfactory way? So how can we explain this quote-unquote puzzling rise of the welfare state in these countries? Most of these countries, like Turkey, in these countries, welfare state until the 1990s covered only half of the population, and most rural and urban populations in the informal economy were excluded from any welfare state provision. But now we see that we see that like close to 90% of population in Turkey belongs to or benefit from some kind of welfare programs. And these examples from these countries show the extent of social assistance programs, and social assistance and healthcare for the poor in general, income-based pro-poor policies were the engine of welfare state development in these countries. So my question is, what is the relationship between contentious politics and welfare provision in countries like Turkey? And in the specific case, what is the relationship between specific contentious political actors like Kurdish movement, Islamist movement, like formal workers, informal workers, rural and urban poor? So what is the effect of this contentious politics on welfare state? And as I said, what explains the welfare state development in neoliberalism? And I have tried to show that the rise of the poor as a key political threat, as well as a key political support, was the main factor that was driving the expansion of the social assistance programs, and in an effort to contain the poor people's unrest, and in an effort to mobilize their popular support. And I was very much inspired by the work of Francis Fox-Piven and Richard Clavert, who in the 1970s showed that the social assistance expansion in the United States was a response not only or not to social need or increasing poverty, but as a response to Black riots of the period. Therefore, I theoretically argue that the governments expand social assistance not when or where people are poor, but rather when or where the poor become radicalized. So my basic research question was, what is the cause of the welfare state expansion in Turkey? And my theoretical challenge here was the existing welfare state development literature, which said that everyone is observing a social assistance boom, and people refer to what I call structuralist factors, which are demographic changes, deindustrialization, informalization, rising poverty, aging population, and increasing financial constraints of traditional welfare systems. They refer to these concepts or processes to explain the expansion of social assistance programs. And in this narrative, we almost feel that it is almost automatic. It's an almost automatic response to changing social needs. And there is a new phenomenon of poverty, and new social assistance programs emerge to meet this demand, to meet this challenge. But I look at a previous literature from the mid-20th century, which tell us a different picture. So when you look at the history of the welfare state, we see a pendulum-like movement from the 19th century to the mid-20th century. We see a shift from social assistance policies to social security policies. And then from the 1970s on, we see a shift back from social security policies to social assistance policies. The 19th century like limited welfare state or social policies were mostly based on social assistance or poor relief. For example, the British poor laws are important examples of this trend. Then we see the rise of the modern like European welfare state in the mid-20th century. And then from the 1980s on, there is this social assistance boom. And the literature that look at the first transition was a really good combination of political and structural factors. People look at like Keynesian drives and like industrialization, as well as people look at the communist threat, labor militancy, or wartime mobilization, etc., etc. But when we look at the second transition, we see an unsatisfactory or maybe a naive approach to social policy, as if these new social policies were responding to changing structural dynamics that I just referred to. So the role of contentious politics and conflict was to a large extent forgotten. So in a separate article, we show that, so we did a literature review of the global social assistance literature, and we find that only less than 2% of the entire literature look at social movements or contentious politics as a cause or a determinant of social assistance programs. But and a very minority, a little bit more of the literature look at political or electoral competition, but a little bit minority on the contentious politics. In general, politics has been largely forgotten. So I tried to borrow the concepts of two important concepts from the previous literature and apply them to explain the welfare state development in Turkey since the 1970s. These concepts are political containment and political mobilization. Political containment of social unrest and political mobilization of popular support. And these two concepts were my like main instruments to look at the Turkish case. And methodologically, I tried to follow like a multi-method approach to answer this basic question about such a very complex phenomenon. First of all, I think so I will turn back. So my main independent variable in this book is politics, and more specifically contentious politics. Therefore, I needed quantitative indicators of social movements in Turkey, which did not exist. We only had official statistics on strikes. And I did a manual collection of Cumhuriyet newspaper from 1970 on, and I used this microfilm machine at Boğaziçi Library, and I sat down on this thing for more than a year, and it was a challenging process, and I promised myself that no one should do this anymore again. That is why we started to work on automated methods of protest event collection and for the last 10 years. And so the GLOCON dataset and the Turkey section of the GLOCON dataset was what I used in this book. And then we built a global welfare state dataset as part of my previous ERC project. And I used surveys a survey from Conda, and then I use administrative statistics to set up statistically significant relations between my political variables and social welfare provision. And I also did a qualitative analysis of parliamentary proceedings, official reports, and news archives. And I did a content analysis of all welfare state policy-making documents from Turkish proceedings from Turkish Parliament. I look for and I try to understand the extent to which parliamentarians considered social unrest in welfare policy making, and vice versa. I look at like counter-terrorism laws, and I try to find clues about social welfare in their policy making. So let me turn back to this slide. When you look, so despite all this narrative about neoliberal retrenchment, when you look at the numbers, we see a welfare state expansion, and this was my like starting point. So how can we explain then this? And we see that Turkish welfare state did not only expand, but it went through a qualitative change as well. From it changed, the center of the welfare state has changed from employment-based social security policies like emekli sandığı, SSK, Bağkur into income-based social assistance policies like green card or conditional cash transfers, şart nakit transferleri. And this change actually did not happen in in a gradual linear way, but it went through certain fluctuations, and these fluctuations were constituting a central puzzle to my analysis because they were negating the validity of structuralist arguments, because all structural trends that were mentioned in the literature were following a gradual linear path since the last 40 years. Population aging, informalization, deindustrialization, rural to urban migration, they continue to grow over these 4 decades. But I will show you some examples. Welfare policies follow the tortuous fluctuating path. And so in the I did some periodization. First, this welfare state establishment, employment-based policies. In the 1980s, there was a period of retrenchment. In the 1990s, expansion of both income-based and employment-based policies. And in the 2000s, retrenchment of employment-based and expansion of income-based policies. And so as part of this broader project, we analyzed countries like Turkey, and out of a quantitative analysis, we show that Turkey is part of a new welfare state regime, which we call the populist welfare state regime. So this welfare state regime, I don't know if you are familiar with this welfare regimes literature from Gösta Esping Anderson. But we try to introduce a new welfare state regime into this big literature, including Turkey, China, India, Brazil, Argentina, South Africa. All these countries are very similar to each other, and they are different from other welfare states. And yeah, this is, as a side note, this is the GLOCOM website and our data set on protest activities. And this is like sahibinden.com. You are choosing not a rental house, but a protest type, and it will give you visualization. This is from India, for example. This is the GLOBE welfare state data set. And this is one of the starting figures of the book, which is really interesting. These three things. So productivity, industrial and manufacturing productivity. These are real wages in Turkey, and these are the levels of like workers in strike. So and if you ask what determines wages in an industry or in a country to an like a mainstream economist, then the answer would be that so productivity, real wages will follow productivity levels. But we have to add a reservation or a phrase or a condition to the sentence, because it seems from this picture that real wages follow productivity levels only insofar as workers are on strike or workers are powerful, that when there is labor unrest. So during the 1970s, 60s and 70s, productivity levels increased and real wages follow suit because the workers' strike were also on the rise. In the 1980s, after the coup, strikes went down, and while productivity levels continued to increase, wage levels declined. And during the early 1990s, and this is the most important like counterfactual case to this mainstream narrative, because in the middle of this neoliberal transformation, so we have this largest labor unrest wave in Turkey. This is called Spring Actions, Bahar Eylemleri. And during this period, in fact, more than like close to 3 million workers from time to time joined like formal and informal forms of labor unrest. And as a response, real wages increased back. And once this labor unrest went to a halt, then while productivity levels continued to increase, then the gap between real wages and productivity started to increase again. So productivity level is like it's going constant, so it's a linear function, but wage levels are fluctuating as a response to social unrest. And another picture from minimum retirement age is also telling. So we know this story from the most recent EYT discussions. So again, our economists, when we ask what determines the minimum retirement age, then he or she would say, well, average life expectancy, I would say. So when the population gets older, you would expect higher retirement ages. But in Turkey, from 1950s to 1980s, late 1970s, while the population grew elder, we saw that minimum retirement age decreased because there was huge labor mobilization. And after the 1980s, after the coup, we see a sudden increase in minimum retirement age. And then during the spring actions, then despite the population continued to grow older, we see a drop in minimum retirement age. And then during the 2000s, we see a continuous increase in minimum retirement age. And we see that, I mean, before the elections, EYT discussions show how politics matter in this kind of decisions. We can talk about EYT more. And I coded every single welfare policy document, welfare law passed in the Turkish parliament according to 4 criteria: whether it is expanding social security benefits, whether it's retrenching employment-based social security benefits, whether it is expanding social assistance or retrenching social assistance. And in practice, there is no law that retrenches social assistance. So I only illustrate 3 categories. So this show that yes, after the coup, there is a huge retrenchment of social security, and 1990s social security is back, and after the 1990s, after the spring action labor unrest was repressed, then we see that real retrenchment of social security policies resumed, while at the same time social assistance starts to increase. So we see that the expansion of social assistance and retrenchment of employment-based benefits went in parallel. This is a basic figure to show that social assistance programs are expanding. I'm sure you are all familiar with this. In like 2 years ago, we did another survey with Conda, and to show that, and we show that 30% of the population in Turkey is benefiting from at least one social assistance program, and 40% of the population has ever benefited from one social program, a social assistance program. So we are talking about a really huge phenomenon. And then to explain this, why we are seeing such fluctuations of programs and an expansion of the welfare state, and why this expansion is mostly led by social assistance, then I look at social movements. This is the total number of grassroots political events from 1970 to 2017. So in the end, that data set included over 40,000 entries and classified according to different categories, ideal, like participant type, event type, organizer type, violent or not, ethnicity, location, and some others that I forget now. So we see this is the total number of events. It's interesting. So these are the heydays of social movements in Turkey in the 1970s. But today, even we see numbers quite like parallel to the 1970s. So social movements are not dying. So so this is my main point in the book, is that so welfare state did not die during neoliberalism, but it has expanded. So this is one thing. And the second thing is social welfare state is switched from social security to social assistance. And the question is why? And then my answer was that this is because social movements in Turkey shifted from the center of grassroots politics, I would say, has shifted from the formal working class to the informal working class, and from non-Kurds to Kurds. So there is a class-wise and an ethnic shift in the totality of social movements. And governments, and like Turkish government, used social welfare policies not only to help people, but mostly to contain social unrest. And welfare policies shifted from social security to social assistance because the most important threat for the government now are informal workers and the Kurds, rather than formal workers and non-Kurds, or you would say like Turks. And that shift actually, therefore, should be explained with respect to politics and contentious politics. So these are the activities of the formal proletariat, and these are the activities of the socialist movement. Socialist movements were mainly mobilizing the formal proletariat, and this is the informal proletariat, and people working in unregulated jobs, like street vendors, textile workers, construction workers, like services, most of the people. And so people working in an unsecure environment without social security are called part of the informal working class. This is the Islamist movement. And if we are familiar with the work of Cihan Tugal, this is kind of confirming his book, because he said the radical Islamist movement increased in the 1990s, and the AKP's rise was actually a passive revolution of this radical Islamist threat. And we see that after the AKP rule, radicalization of the Islamist movement declined, but with our data did not include years after the attempt coup in 2016. So this is the Kurdish movement, and yeah. So I argue that now the informal workers are replacing formal workers as the main threat for the government. And this is not only a result of structural tendencies of they are more vulnerable or they are poorer, etc. But I look at changing the centrality of different political actors that mobilized and radicalized these groups. In the 1970s, it was the socialist movement who radicalized the formal working class. Then after the coup, they lost their power. In the 1990s, it was the radical Islamist movement that radicalized the poor. And then they were pacified after the rise, after the coming to power of the AKP. And then this time, it is the Kurdish movement who mostly radicalized the poor because of the urbanization of the Kurdish population, rapid urbanization of Kurdish population, which is mostly significantly related to internal displacement. Then I finally analyzed the relationship between the Kurdish conflict and the welfare state. So the descriptive statistics show that social assistance programs have been shifted to the Kurdish areas of the country. And so, for example, in central Anatolia and southern eastern Anatolia, this is the West Black Sea and Central East Anatolia have similar levels of poverty, but they have very different incidence of green card holding, 12% and 45%. This is because, I would say, the majority of the, the rate of the Kurdish population in these regions. If there are more Kurds, then the government is giving more social assistance. But these are only descriptive statistics. Then I went to use this Conda survey from 2010. This was a large survey, 10,000 respondent survey. And I tried to analyze who is getting the green card program, the largest social assistance program in Turkey. And when so it is very apparent that it is being Kurdish is the most significant determinant of benefiting from the green card program in Turkey, controlling for the whole bunch of indicators and like neighborhood dummies and etc. Therefore, I read that social assistance programs have become part of the repertoire of the Turkish state in its counterinsurgency efforts. And so we can continue with questions and answers. And finally, it is not only about social unrest, but political competition. And one chapter of the book is about political competition among mainstream or radical political parties. in Turkey. And for example, the competition between AKP and CHP, two main political parties, has a significant class aspect. AKP votes are positively, AKP votes are negatively correlated with income, but CHP votes are positively correlated. And how come the AKP get a huge support from the poor? And this data also shows that the rate of poor people among AKP voters over time increased. So AKP over time became more and more a poor people's party. And once you get the support from the poor, and the first round elections also showed us that once you support get the support, secure the support of the poor people, no matter what happens, like a political crisis, external, internal attacks, or like corruption, nothing. So you secure your place as a ruling party. And if you don't get the support from the poor, then no matter what you do, you cannot become the government. So this is the rule to rule countries like Turkey. So poor people are a huge majority. So Turkey is not a poor country, but there are lots of poor people, and they are the most powerful group in the society as a source of political support and as a source of political threat. And the welfare state development has been shaped by this political dynamic to a large extent. I think, yeah, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Erdem Hocam, for your presentation. I really very much look forward to reading the book itself. With that, I'd like to open the floor for the questions. Our participants can write their questions in the Q&A part of the webinar. I'll give it some time for them to write, but in the meantime, I'll take the use the moderator privilege of asking the first question.
Yeah, and I took this opportunity to share my book because it is open access, and you can download the file from this link.
All right. My question is actually going to be about what inspired you to conduct this work and write this book?
Oh, inspiration, yeah. I was a student of Çağlar Keyder and Ayşe Bura at Boğaziçi University, and I took their classes on social welfare policy, political economy, and I was really, really lucky. So they were incredible courses. And then I worked with Çağlar Hoca in my MA thesis. And actually, they were the key figures in the literature that I targeted in this book and in my last 15 years, because they represented, to my mind, this structuralist trend in explaining social policies, and they were excellent scholars, so they conveyed this message very strongly. And my advisor at Johns Hopkins University was Giovanni Arrighi, and I remember him saying that if you want to criticize someone, don't criticize his or her caricature, but take your target really strong, then do your criticism like that. And And Çağlar Hoca and Ayşe Hoca were like two really strong figures. Then I tried to like have a polemic with them to therefore to show that politics is the most important thing, as opposed to other factors, international factors, or like demographic factors or financial factors, etc. And so one part of it, so this is not included in my dissertation, but one part of in the book, but the important chapter in my dissertation was looking at international agencies, IMF and World Bank, in policy changes in Turkey, because this external and internal actors on the one hand, and political and structural factors on the other hand, they were two important axes of this matrix. And over time, I tried to show that even this external international actors like World Bank and IMF were very much politically motivated when they are making real social policy suggestions to member governments.
I should start reading the book from that chapter.
Uh,
As an IMF enthusiast, let me call myself. We do have some questions in the Q&A part, so I'll just start reading them out loud for those of you who are watching this on YouTube after we upload it. Well, the first one is more like a statement, less like a question from an anonymous attendee saying, Turks abroad voted more for AKP, but they're not poor.
Yeah, so poverty, this is an important point, because I'm here not trying to explain political behavior by looking at welfare policies, but I'm trying to explain welfare state policies by analyzing political behavior including like voting and protesting, because voting for AKP has a complex phenomenon, and poverty and class is only one factor, and social policies are also one factor. So we cannot explain AKP's rise to power and hegemony by only saying that they provide social assistance to people, but we can argue for the opposite causal direction. The rise of social policies and social assistance policies is very much related to AKP's expanding and declining hegemony over the poor. And so therefore the voters, Turkish citizens in Europe, they are not poor, but they have other reasons to vote for AKP, ideological, cultural, etc. This is not our discussion here.
Thank you very much, Hocam. The next question is from Paula. How the result of the elections would affect this welfare state build, especially if Erdogan loses, since he has been building a state and institutions to support his politics for more than a decade. Well, more than 2 decades at this point. Can this build welfare state one of the main reasons why he won the first round? Sorry if this sounds like there is no wrong question, Paula. So yeah. I'm not going to read that part, but saying that she's not from Turkey, so.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Yes, AKP's really continuing hegemony is very much related to the fact that they get their support from the poor. And the way to get the support from the poor has some instruments, like nationalism is one thing, religiosity is one thing, but social assistance policies is also one thing, and a very important factor. I don't know if it is the most important, but it's important enough. And for winning the first round, yes, it is important, because they introduced a new program, aile destekleri programı, inspired from CHP's aile destekleri sigortası, and they introduced a program run by the president, like Cumhurbaşkanlığı, the president's office, and the program's end date is July or June, right after the elections. So this cannot be more apparent. But so the fact that so CHP historically relied on middle class votes, and they were really not powerful, and we see that their candidate is like competing with Erdogan, and we most probably see a close margin in the second round, maybe 3-2% points. This is because CHP is able to get votes support from the poor people as well, because they paid more attention to the economic crisis, unlike previous CHP leaders. And they also started to promise new social assistance programs, much more generous than AKP's. And for example, the aile destekleri family support program included one item to provide a gold card every month. Every mother from every poor family will receive social assistance support, which is equal to one, it's almost one minimum wage, 9,000 lira, like $500. It's a huge amount. And this is basically means-tested basic income for poor families. Therefore, if CHP wins the elections, then I assume that this social assistance expansion will continue. If AKP wins, it will continue as well, because there is a lot of poverty and the crisis is getting deeper and deeper. And the cheapest, economically cheapest and politically the most return policy here in these conditions is social assistance. So therefore they will expand that.
Oh, thank you very much, Hocam. We have a lot of other questions, so I'll quickly move on to the next one. Alia is asking, do these Western Black Sea populations have a chance to get other sort of subsidies that might explain why they may have not green cards? For example, do they receive cash assistance or cash subsidies for farming or fishing?
Yes, but not more than the other regions. So they are underrepresented, and I mean, compared to the Kurdish minority, no one is getting something more than the average. Because there is this ethnic dimension and there is this ethnic unrest in addition to political competition.
Thank you, Hocam. Simon's asking, you mentioned that productivity is linear, but real wages fluctuates with labor unrest. Is it possible that increased welfare would decrease the degree of labor unrest, ultimately result in lower real wages, while productivity would keep increasing?
Well, yeah, I mean, this endogeneity issue is worth considering, and we are working on a separate paper that takes wage levels and working hours, weekly working hours, and minimum retirement age pensions as a function of labor unrest in a time series analysis. And in this analysis, we will try to consider this endogeneity effect control for it. This is a possibility, but I mean, without empirical results, I cannot rule this possibility out. But I would still support a causal relationship here. You are.
Forgot to unmute myself. Jones was asking, have the instant and rapid bumps in social assistance services during approaching election times been upholded and continued in the past election periods? Should that not create a gradual and linear increase in welfare policies?
I didn't quite get have instant and rapid bump during approaching election. I think I didn't understand the question very well.
Johnson, do you want to clarify the question, adding maybe like a one-liner to summarize what you said? And in the meantime, maybe we can move on to the next question so as not to spend time for now. Dilal's asking, the ruling party offers money to poor people and gets their votes. Poor people sometimes reluctantly vote for the ruling party because they're not well off and they need money. What can be done to get poor people out of this situation? How can the gap between the rich and the poor in Turkey be bridged?
Yeah, that's a very important fundamental question. So social assistance policies are trying to alleviate poverty which already emerged. But what causes poverty? So one thing, one important thing is low wages in the country. And we know that 42% of workers in the country get the minimum wage. Minimum wage has almost become the mean average wage. That percentage is only 2% in the Netherlands, for example. In short, wages are too small in Turkey. This is one part of the poverty, and unemployment is large. The informal sector is very large, and therefore there are such political economic factors that create poverty, and social assistance policies are only trying to level out some part of them. And many analyses from Devlet Planlama Teşkilatı, State Planning Organization, illustrated that social assistance programs during the AKP era did not function to decrease poverty. This is important. They are not closing the poverty gap. They are not alleviating poverty, but they are helping to regulate the poor and discipline the poor and managing the poor. Therefore, on the one hand, conditions in the labor market, labor security, and job security, and higher or reasonable wages should be established. This is one part. And in terms of public policies, I would suggest something like a basic income structure, and what CHP is offering makes more sense, because you should provide, if you are providing social assistance, then its amount should be enough to take you out of the poverty line. Otherwise, you are poor, and you are then social assistant getting poor, but you are still poor. So the quantity and quality of social assistance programs should change if you really want to fight poverty.
Thank you very much, Hocam. And in the meantime, Cansu sent a clarification similar to what AKP did with EYT just before the elections. If these policies are continued later on, wouldn't that cause a gradual increase in welfare policies? Also, you have mentioned that the social assistance is now directed mostly towards the Kurdish population. Which part of the society was the majority of social assistance and social security services directed to before, during the times of mobilization and radicalization of the workers by socialists and Islamists?
Yeah, now I understand. Sorry about my incapacity to understand before. Yeah, I mean, Turkey, my book starts with this sentence: Turkey is a difficult country to live in, but it is even more difficult to rule. So there are lots of political contentions in the country, and there are lots of elections, local elections, general elections, and every 2 years we are electing something, and all these electoral cycles creating populist pressures. And since the main popular vote base is the poor, they are expanding social assistance programs. And these little variations, I agreed. So they end up with almost a continuous increase in social assistance. And also social movements as well are also very active. And by social movements, I shouldn't use the word social movements, but contentious politics in general, because violent armed conflict, guerrilla conflict, and violent social unrest, or like strikes, demonstrations, peaceful sit-ins, they're all covered in this broader definition of contentious politics, any kind of challenge from bottom up. And so we also see a continuity in social like contentious politics, and that makes social assistance programs rise in a linear fashion. Merih Hocam, you are frozen, but can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Merih Hocam.
Hocam, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. I think my internet is still unstable, but
Yeah,
I dropped a second.
I think we both lost our connections. You are in the school, right?
I'll just turn off my camera. Maybe the
Okay.
connection will improve then. If you can still hear me, that's fine.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, I am just checking if I can see you for some reason.
Acaba dinleyicilerimizden birisi yazabilir mi? Beni duyabiliyor mu diye. Evet ya da hayır yazabilirseniz.
Sorry about that. I think my Wi-Fi got really unstable at some point. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I just connected to my my phone. I hope everyone was able to hear what you said. Did I interrupt the connection? Because I assign you as the co-host regardless. So okay, you're the host now. Okay, cool. Shall I just read out loud the next question in line?
Yes,
okay, perfect. Eylem's asking, you mentioned the electoral support of people living in poverty. My question is, What do you think about economic voting hypothesis for the electoral outcomes in Turkey? Do you think that these hypotheses are applicable in the case of Turkey?
Well, difficult question. The first round of the elections, they are not totally applicable. I mean, because people were expecting that the economic prices would have an effect on voting behavior, but we see that no, people are like embracing their political identity and their ideas about their concerns about security it seems that they are more important. So I mean, Ali Charkoğlu knows this the most, and he was last week he was having a webinar that I watched. So he was talking about this two strands of voting, and electoral voting on the one hand, and generational transition of voting behavior, a more complex thing. So we are living in an habitus of families and traditions and identification with the leader. I think these are important, but without the economic crisis, maybe the picture would be much different. Maybe we would see that Erdogan would win in the first round with 55%. So we cannot simply negate electoral economic voting hypothesis, I think.
Thank you, Erdem. Kerem's asking, since you mentioned the relationship between social assistance programs and the party politics at the end, considering that the governments are holding the economical and logistic means for providing assistance to poor, are they always the most advantageous side in electoral campaigns in the countries you mentioned? Or what are the most successful strategies adopted by the opposition in these countries to compensate these disadvantages?
Yeah. Well, so people, all around the world are discussing how to beat populists and autocrats, populist, right-wing leaders, and it's a huge political and intellectual debate. And in Brazil, it happened, but with a very little, tiny margin of votes, Lula won the elections. And in the last 1 month before the elections, Bolsonaro started to deliver a lot of public resources and public programs like oil subsidies, etc. And he was able to close the gap very rapidly. And my friends were telling me that if the elections happened a month later, Bolsonaro would most probably win. And therefore, if likewise, I mean, Bolsonaro was using this, but during the early 2000s, Lula was himself using that strategy even more successfully. He's also a populist leader, a left populist, and he won 2 elections, 2006 and 2010 elections in Brazil, because mostly of the Bolsa Familia program. There are lots of publications that tell how Bolsa Familia won him two elections. Therefore, on the one hand, the opposition leaders, they are now starting to understand that poor people are the key voting group, and you have to get their support, and you cannot negate social assistance programs as populist devil tools by the populist leaders. If you are entering into a competition, you also have to promise something to the poor people. And in Brazil, the people from the rural poor and the poor people from favelas, they were excluded from the social welfare system for a long time, and only in favelas, only the drug traffickers were helping them. And Lula was the first to deliver them something, and he became a hero. And Erdogan as well, and Modi as well, Orban as well. So these people, these leaders they know how to use such policies very well, and the opposition should also learn. And I believe that I mean, in Turkey, the opposition has learned quite a lot. They delivered a lot of programs. They promised a lot of programs. This gold card, or some like cash support for young people, or free lunch at schools, at all schools, and at things like that. And I mean, this political polarization and identification with Erdogan is a really strong feeling. That is why the opposition could not get what they were hoping to get. But still, I think this is the way to go.
Thank you, Erdem. General just saying, thank you, Erdem Hoca, for this excellent talk. How persistent are institutions that are aligned with structural and agential factors in the current welfare regime?
Which question is this?
It's if you go down a little bit, I think I skipped 2-3 questions for now. I'll go back to them. I can just put it in the chat box too, if that's easier.
Huh.
There we go.
How persistent are institutions that are aligned with structural and agential factors in the current welfare regimes? I think I mean, the structural and agency-based factors that led to the formation of this populist welfare state regime are still out there. We are, first of all, rising poverty is the most structural factor, and we are again going through an economic crisis, and poverty will increase. And poverty usually interacts with existing political, like ideological, religious, ethnic, racial, like grievances, and this interaction turns the poor as a source of threat and maybe a source of support. And therefore, I would expect that this trend will continue a little bit more. And so in the 1980s, which was or in the 1990s, which was the hegemonic days of neoliberalism, and people were like very happy about the retrenchment and liberalization of the economy. But after 2008 crisis, and after the pandemic, people started to call for state intervention as well. And in the middle run, I think a neo-Keynesian world will come back, just like Keynesian period followed liberal period, and the neoliberal period followed Keynesian period, and I think a neo-Keynesian period will follow the neoliberal period. But until that point on, I think we will see a continuing trend in this way.
Thank you, Jim. I'll continue with questions from audience who haven't asked the question, and then if we have enough time left, then we'll go back to the other questions. Ali is asking, there is currently a clear discrepancy between Turkey's economic performance and its population support for Erdogan. How is he able to maintain his voter base while inflation is near records high? It is
Well,
record high, but we kind of actually spoke about this a little bit, if you'd like to add anything.
yeah, I mean, people have been discussing this since the first round of the elections, and I think this concerns about security or nationalism basically is the key factor. People were convinced by the government that government will protect them against the internal and external threats. But still, this is puzzling for me, because normally if there is a rise in a violent internal conflict, you would expect such a securitist nationalist response, but we haven't seen any violent events in the Kurdish area for a long time. And it is puzzling for me that how people are that much worried about that threat. So when people are asked what is the most important problem in Turkey today, 70% of them said it's economic crisis, poverty, unemployment, etc. And only 2% of them would say terrorism. So a couple of years ago, this was 50-60%. And still, so the government, in one way or another, managed to convince people that this was a real threat. And yeah, I'm still trying to find an answer, so I don't have a really good answer for this. We are all puzzled.
Thank you, Erdem. Merih is asking, would you agree with the fact that income-based welfare system would not be sufficient in a world where there are lots of other social inequalities and injustices?
Sufficient for what? I mean, philosophically and socially, I am sure that it is not sufficient for human dignity and a satisfactory human life, because for me, so there shouldn't be poverty, so there shouldn't be any poverty alleviation at all. But the problem is that, so my main point is that such policies are not trying to end poverty. They are trying to politically politically regulate poor people. And the question is whether they are sufficient in such a political objective. The governments are asking these questions to themselves.
Thank you. Fırat is asking, can we say social assistance is a gain for the informal proletariat, a gain they achieve through protest? If so, what can we say about the formal proletariat and the contraction of the earlier employment-based welfare state policies?
Yeah, good question. You can see a public policy as a concession or as a containment strategy. What I mean is, when looking at social assistance programs, you cannot easily say that these are like bad things for the people or the poor people. A program in itself and by itself, by its design, amount, or form, does not tell us about its real function in this political environment. The most critical thing is who demands these programs. A single program, the same program in one context and in another context can fulfill very different functions. In the one case, it functions to contain a social unrest, but in another context, it can function to trigger further social unrest. Here, the key factor is who is demanding this. And what Kna from our project and from sociology department, maybe he's here, I don't know. So he's working on this problematic in his dissertation thesis. He's comparing India and Brazil, two countries in which similar kinds of social policies are developed to contain two big rural social movements, the landless people's movements in Brazil and the Maoist unrest in India. And in Brazil, it functions to contain the movement, but in India, not. The critical factor here is that in India, the Maoists understand this trick, this strategy, and they follow the strategy of embodying and demanding more social assistance as a demand of their movement. They said, okay, so you are giving us NREGA program, we want more. We want higher levels. We want it for more people. And when you frame a social movement in such a way as a demand of the movement, then whatever the government delivers to you would only help you to demand more and mobilize more. And therefore, the critical thing is who is demanding that movement. If in this case of Turkey and in the Kurdish case, I think we cannot say that social assistance programs are a gain of the Kurdish movement, because they are not demanding it. Kurds, as far as I know, did never demand a green card or any kind of social assistance from the government. They demand something else, cultural, ethnic rights, and as a response, they are provided with social assistance. And that makes green card as a containment strategy in Turkey. But in the case of the 1970s, the expansion of social security benefits in Turkey could be seen as a gain, a success on behalf of the working class movement, because at least part of them demanded growing or higher welfare policies from the government. Some of them demanded, or not demanded, but they struggled for revolution. And while they were struggling for revolution, they were provided social welfare benefits as a form of containment, obviously. This was not a gain for them. It was a containment strategy. But if you are demanding higher social security benefits, and if you are getting more social security benefits, usually you continue your movement. You are not pacified.
Thank you, Erdem. Ilayda is asking, if CHP wins the election, do you think they will continue implementing the gendered familialism policies?
Gendered family policies of the governing AKP?
I was going to ask that too. Could you clarify that, Ilayda? And in the meantime, we'll move on to another question. We still have a lot of questions in the chat.
I mean, if
Ilayda said yes, so we can just,
If this is, she's referring to the AKP policies, I would say no, but it depends on the strength and pressures from the feminist movement. So, I mean, if there is, what I learned is that if there is pressure and demand from the society, then political actors should react accordingly. So, I mean, I would never trust any political party. They are all like elites and male and political parties. So pressure is translated into policies, then we can expect something.
Thank you. Going back to Elena, could the inability of the opposition to effectively connect with the lower income segments of the society be a contributing factor. How can the opposition have a better or stronger communication, or how can they convince the poor class?
Yeah, very important. So I mean, we are all thinking that AKP won the first round and they keep winning all elections because of some rhetoric, some ideologies, some promises, etc. These are all important, but we are forgetting something. They are very much and organically organized in poor communities since the 1990s. That's what I tried to write in my book. I mean, the Welfare Party, Refah Partisi, in the 1990s started to organize in poor working class slum areas in Istanbul. And when they first won Istanbul municipality, the first metro that they built was to Bağcılar, not to Etiler. So they were important, and they have a really daily relationship with poor people. They take care of these poor people, they help them, they create a community among them. So a friend of mine told me that, so she was working during the election day, the AKP responsible person in this classroom. He was like saying hello, welcome, goodbye, bye-bye to every single voter coming to the classroom. They have an organic relationship, and AKP has 11 million members to the party. So we should not forget this. And this is a long history, 30 years of organizing activity. You cannot change the society by only telling good stories or like having good appearances on the social media. I think the opposition, despite some problems, it did a good job in the election campaign, much better than we were all expecting. But there is a more structural and historical strong tie between this government and the poor people in the country, which is hard to like criticize or break down.
Thank you, Erdem. Alberto's, thanking you very much for your presentation and insights on this topic. The question is, overall, I was wondering whether you think in the end it is possible for bigger countries of this type like China to change into high welfare states similar to the Netherlands or Scandinavia. It is really broad, I know, but it is what I wonder myself often. Thank you very much.
Well, a short answer is you should have a look at the work of Stein Kuhnle. Let me write down his name. He's a Norwegian scholar of social policies. He's really well known, and most recently he is working extensively on China and this Nordic welfare state relations. But my long, and it's again short, but I don't think that China will ever have a Nordic kind of welfare state, because it's like Nordic welfare states have a universalist flat rate welfare system. So everyone is getting this, I mean, similar levels of social benefits independently of employment status, and the population, and population size is really also important. It is, and with the current rate of economic growth in China, I don't know when they will have the capacity to provide such huge programs for the entire population, and they are taking this cheap way of providing social cash programs to the to workers, and especially they are They are targeting migrant workers mostly because they are the most like threatening part of the working class in China. They are involved in the most labor unrest. And for these reasons, I wouldn't expect a similar path.
Thank you, Erdem. Berke's question: how much does Islamic social help can replace governmental care? And if it can replace, how much does the people care about whether it is governmental or social?
You mean the Islamic charity organizations?
That's what I thought, but
Berke,
clarify, Berke.
I mean, it's obviously impossible for like these non-governmental organizations or civil society to replace the entire state apparatus and their social public resources. But what we observe is that Islamic non-governmental networks of social solidarity and state policies are not competing with each other, but they are building a network. They are working together. I mean, Islamic Waqfs are working closely with like local public offices, for example. So when you apply to green card or a conditional cash transfer, you are taking part in, you are applying to a local board, and members of this local board are very much connected to this Islamic non-governmental social assistance providers. I think they are growing together. They are not replacing each other.
Thank you, Erdem. Now I'm going back to the first question left from Alia. So her second question, therefore, is: do you see this as a new trend by the Turkish state, or has this always been a trend set by the Turkish state since its founding, as suggested by Ayşe Buğra? Could we argue that the Turkish state has always attempted to mitigate unrest by catering to the rural poor, i.e. the elimination of the tithe in 1927, despite the importance of this tax for the central state's coffers?
Great question. I totally agree. And not only for Turkey, but for other countries. I think this is a historical and a more international pattern. Governments are targeting populations not according to their need, but according to their political activism. And so government's social policies, therefore, are changing historically according to changes in the threat and form of social threat, political threat that is coming from different political groups. And so I think at least this dimension of social unrest should be taken into consideration in analysis. I am not claiming that this is the most important factor that explains social policies, but it's a key important factor for sure.
Thank you, Erdem. From our anonymous attendee, and I assumed all the questions are coming from the same anonymous attendee here, so only related to your last point: if poor people control who is in power and they have received larger and larger amounts of social welfare state assistance, why has the AKP received its least amount of votes in parliament in the last election that it has ever received in the last 20 years? In Istanbul, AKP and CHP received almost equal votes. Poor people do not live in Istanbul. Mostly middle class and rich people live. Doesn't it contradict with what you say? And then last point: in Istanbul and Ankara, AKP and CHP received almost equal votes.
The same
Poor
question.
people do not live in Istanbul and Ankara, mostly middle class and rich people. Doesn't it contradict with what you said?
Okay, good question. So, first of all, the fact that AKP is providing social assistance is not a guarantee of getting the most votes. They are providing, but they are becoming more and more insufficient to help people in poverty. So they are getting 1,500 lira. This was an important amount 1 year ago, but this is not important now because of the huge inflation. So it is not helping. So that's why we are seeing a decline in votes. And what in big cities, the thing is really important. We see that in metropolitan areas, CHP got more votes than other cities, and CHP has more votes than the AKP. Or Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu got more votes than Erdogan, unlike small cities. Why? I don't think that in big cities there are only there are only rich and middle class people. They are a minority. So we did a survey research a couple of years ago, and we found out that close to 60% of the population in Istanbul belong to the working class in the way we define working class, but they are not middle class people or the rich people. I mean white, beyaz yaka, white collar, corporate, or like new middle class people like ourselves are only 2%, 3% of the population in Istanbul. So we are a small minority. So when we talk about Istanbul, it's a huge city of poor people, and poor people in metropolitan areas are suffering from the economic crisis the most, because the rents increase the most here, and the prices of commodities increase most. While when we look at like Kayseri, Gaziantep, or like Kütahya, we see that people did not suffer from the crisis that much because they are, first of all, inflation is not that much in these regions, and second, they are still connected to the countryside. They are getting some some benefits from the land, or they own their own apartment in Kütahya. And if you are, for example, have a permanent job, then the government increased minimum wage levels spectacularly. If you are getting 2 minimum wages, which means almost 20,000 lira in Kütahya, then you are not really in a bad situation. But in Istanbul, you are done. Therefore, I think people suffered much more in the metropolitan areas, and they moved towards the CHP. But in the countryside, in small cities, they did not that much, and they could continue to ally with to align themselves with the AKP.
Thank you so much, Hocam. There is one last question left, but we're already past our time. So I'll let you decide if you'd like to take the question or should we ask?
Yeah.
Kerem's asking, are the redistribution of wealth to the poor by the wealthier favored by the spoil system included or considered as an informal way of social assistance in these studies? For example, local business people or politicians with undeserved gain from government bidding, giving job positions to the poor.
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, this is not social assistance. So by social assistance, I know what you mean, but by social assistance, we mean like government or public policies. These are, I mean, you can call them something else, like patronage or clientelism, something else, but not or some not social assistance, I think.
with that, I guess we can conclude the talk. Thank you so very much for this fantastic book talk.
I really thank you so much for organizing and for these excellent questions, and it blows my mind. So I'm so happy that my talk triggered so many excellent questions.
Proud to say most of them are our students, so that's good news for us.
I really hope that I could give proper answers.
We really enjoyed the Q&A session as well. And again, for those of you who haven't noticed, Erdem Hoca actually put the link to the book itself. It's open access, so you can download it and enjoy reading the book. With that, I also thank our audience very much for this really engaging discussion, and we will keep you posted about our next book talk before the spring 2023 semester ends. And again, wish you all a great rest of the week, and we'll see you after the elections.
Yeah, good luck everyone, and thank you very much. I really enjoyed, and I hope you too. And thanks.
Thank you. Hocam, I think you need to stop recording because I'm not the host anymore.
Okay, I'm just closing.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.